About 6 years ago, I went through one of the scariest experiences of my life. I've lived in West Virginia my whole life, and I'm used to being out in remote areas, reading the woods, and keeping myself safe without much help. Still, nothing I'd learned out there ever prepared me for how strange everything was. And you'll see what I mean by strange, because that's exactly how it felt, and even now I don't have any real explanation for it. My family owns a small cabin tucked deep in the mountains, completely isolated from everything. It's nothing fancy and definitely not the kind of place you'd want to spend months living in, but it's been in my family since my grandparents were young, and I've always felt responsible for keeping it standing. I live in the city, so I only get to visit it every now and then. Usually just long enough to do a few repairs and remind myself why I love the place. 6 years back, I changed jobs. The schedule was strange. 6 months of non-stop work followed by 6 months completely off. It wasn't ideal having all my free time in the dead of winter, but after working year-round for so long, I wasn't about to complain. Plus, winter meant I finally had the chance to spend long stretches of time at the cabin and slowly fix what had been falling apart, all while doing my favorite thing, spending whole evenings reading by the fireplace. It was my first time staying there for more than a weekend, and instead of being nervous, I was genuinely excited. I pictured myself lighting the fireplace every night, reading for hours, actually relaxing for the first time in years. When the weather cleared, I planned to take long hikes through the ridge trails I grew up exploring. There were so many possibilities that I drove up the mountain that first day feeling happier than I had in a long time. The first 2 weeks were rough, I won't lie. The cabin was in worse shape than I remembered. The nights were bone cold, and during heavy rain, 2 different spots leaked badly enough that I had to set buckets down. I made trip after trip to the nearest town for tools, insulation, and cheap lumber, slowly turning the place into something I could tolerate. Even with how exhausting it was, I enjoyed it. The isolation didn't bother me at all. If anything, it felt good to be away from everything for once. And during those first couple of weeks, nothing felt strange. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything was exactly how it should be. Until one particular afternoon, I came back to the cabin after a long haul of materials. And that was when things started slipping sideways. The air outside carried that thin, cutting chill that shows up when the weather's getting ready to turn. Yet the second I opened the door, I felt a cold inside that almost outmatched the one outside. It hit me in a flat, steady wave, the kind that didn't make sense for a room that had been locked up all day. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't closed the door properly before leaving, but the latch was still in place. I stepped inside anyway, rubbing my hands together while I tried not to think too much. The place looked normal at first glance, just as messy as I'd left it. Then I spotted a single glass on the counter, still wet inside. I was almost certain I'd washed every dish that morning and left them all upside down on the old towel near the sink. I just stood there a moment, staring at that one glass like it was supposed to explain something to me. But after a full day of hauling boards and driving up and down the mountain, the last thing I wanted was to create problems out of nothing. So I chalked it up to exhaustion and moved on. Even so, the whole cabin felt off. I walked around with that weight in my chest. Every corner I looked at felt like it had just been vacated. Still, after walking the place a couple of times and finding everything else in its place, I convinced myself that the cold was probably sneaking in through one of the spots I hadn't patched yet. The place had so many gaps that sometimes I joked the cabin breathed more than I did. I tried letting the whole thing go. I lit the fireplace, made a quick dinner, and settled on the couch with the book I'd been dragging around for weeks. The fire took the edge off the cold pretty fast, and after an hour or two, the crackling and the smell of burning wood had me fully relaxed. The book turned out to be better than I'd expected, and the quiet of the mountains made it easy to fall into the story. For a while, I forgot all about the glass, the cold, the strange feeling of being watched. It must have been close to midnight when I heard what sounded like a cabinet door easing open. It wasn't loud, just that soft wooden shift that happens when hinges move slow. I froze with the book still in my hand. A few seconds later, I heard it again. A little clearer this time. It came from the direction of the bedroom, and suddenly that old wave of unease came crashing back even heavier than before. I tried to tell myself it could have been the wood settling or some draft pushing on a loose hinge, but the truth was, I'd lived in that cabin long enough to know every sound it made. This wasn't one of them. The silence that followed was worse, because it felt deliberate, like someone waiting me out. I know it sounds like a strange thing to say, but that's exactly what I felt. An oppressive kind of silence. I finally stood up, grabbed one of the kitchen knives, and went through the whole place corner by corner. I checked the bathroom, the bedroom, the closet, even the crawl space under the bed. By the time I pulled down the ladder to peek into the tiny attic, my hands were shaking so badly I had to take a breath before climbing up. The attic was empty. Just the old trunks and boxes my grandfather had stuffed up there decades ago. It didn't take long to search the entire cabin. Yet I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there with me. The logical part of me kept repeating that there wasn't a single piece of evidence proving anything. And eventually that became enough to at least calm me down a little. I thought about sleeping in the car just in case, but the temperature had dropped so much that I knew I'd be miserable. So I convinced myself the isolation was getting into my head and went back to the couch, trying to act like nothing had happened. Reading was out of the question, so I pulled out my phone and started a movie I downloaded earlier. It worked better than I expected. Within half an hour, the anxiety faded just enough for my body to give in to exhaustion, and I fell asleep without even noticing. What woke me later was a mix of heat on my face and a jolt of panic that didn't come from any dream. I shot upright, and the first thing I saw was the fireplace. The flames were still going strong, high enough that the shadows were moving across the walls. I knew for a fact that when I'd put the movie on, the last log had been almost burned through. There shouldn't have been any fire left at all. Then I noticed the 2 fresh logs sitting in the flames. Someone had added them. Someone had been moving around while I slept on the couch just a few feet away. My body reacted faster than my thoughts did. I stood up so quickly I nearly tripped. And that's when I saw him. He was sitting at the far end of the same couch I'd been sleeping on, perfectly still, his posture stiff. His face was dimly lit by the fire, and his eyes were fixed on the flames like he hadn't even noticed me wake up. I couldn't tell you what happened in the next few seconds. Everything blurred together. The shock, the cold spike of terror running up my spine, the instinct to run so strong it felt like it hollowed me out. I don't know if he looked at me or said anything, or even moved. All I remember clearly is the moment my hands hit the steering wheel of my car, and I realized I was already halfway down the mountain road. As soon as I got a signal, I called the police. I was out of breath and probably not making much sense, but I told them everything. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but eventually said they'd send someone to check it out. The officers went through the cabin in barely 10 minutes. They joked, asked if I'd been drinking, if I'd taken anything, if I had a history of mental issues. Every word made me feel smaller and more embarrassed, but none of it changed what I'd seen. They didn't find anyone, didn't find any sign of forced entry, and left acting like I'd wasted their time. I left right behind them, and the last thing I heard was one of them laughing before the cruiser door shut. I haven't been back since. I don't know who he was, or how long he'd been inside while I slept. And I don't think I want to know. Even now, I still check every room in my house before going to bed. And there are nights when I lie awake wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. I've spent most of my life tucked somewhere along the Appalachian Mountains, moving between small towns and back roads that barely show up on maps. Out here you learn pretty fast that the weather decides everything, and the land has its own mood that you either respect or you get burned by. I've always liked that balance. The isolation, the quiet, the way the world feels honest when you're this far from everything. I've dealt with storms, power outages, washed out roads, wildlife getting too close. Nothing about that ever bothered me. What did bother me was this one night I'm about to talk about. A night that still sits somewhere in the back of my mind, whether I want it or not. It was supposed to be one of those simple, harmless weekends at my cabin. Something I've done 100 times without a second thought. Instead, it turned into one of the most unsettling nights I've ever lived through. The kind that makes you rethink how safe you really are out here, no matter how familiar the woods feel. That night, the storm was already tearing through the ridge long before the sun went down. The kind of storm that makes every tree groan and every gust of wind shake the whole cabin like it's made of cardboard. My friends from town had planned to stay with me for 2 days. Nothing fancy, just a quiet weekend out in the mountains. But they called me before it even hit 8 o'clock saying they weren't coming up. Honestly, I didn't blame them. Driving through those mountain roads with almost no visibility would have been asking for trouble. However, the disappointment hit me harder than I expected. I'd been looking forward to having people around for once, but instead it turned into one of those nights where all I could do was worry about my property. Living out here has way more advantages than drawbacks. But the drawbacks, when they show up, can get dangerous fast. Flash floods, landslides, trees falling. And each time, something expensive gets destroyed. After dinner, I checked the security cameras just to see if anything outside was visible at all. It wasn't. The rain was so heavy, the lenses were basically fogged white. I tossed my phone aside and put on a movie I've watched probably 500 times. It's my go-to when I'm too wired to sit in silence, and I don't want to think about whatever's bothering me. I'd gotten maybe 30 minutes into it when I heard knocking at the front door. It wasn't dramatic or anything, just a solid knock. But it put every muscle in my body on alert immediately. Out here, in the middle of a storm, on a night like that, nobody knocks. I don't have any neighbors, and I'm way too far from any trail. If you hear knocking in this kind of isolation, something's wrong. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed of the front entrance. Nothing. Not even a shadow. I walked to the door as quietly as I could, looked through the peephole, and saw the same thing. Nobody. For a second I wondered if I imagined it, but the sound had been clear enough that I knew I hadn't. I tried to shake it off and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. And that's when I froze. Pressed right up against the kitchen door window was a man wearing one of the most unsettling masks I'd ever seen. He hadn't spotted me yet, but I could see him tugging gently at the back door handle, testing it, like he was trying to find a quiet way in. My first thought was that he'd knocked on the front door to distract me while he came around back. Then another thought hit me just as fast. What if there was more than one of them? I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my gun, and rushed back toward the kitchen ready to scare him off, or worse if I had to. But when I got there, he was already gone. I checked every door and window in the house, then double-checked. Everything was locked and solid. After that, I sat with my phone and watched the camera feeds like my life depended on it. The storm was so heavy that even the motion-detecting cameras weren't catching anything except sheets of rain. I kept watching anyway, barely blinking, trying to convince myself he'd left. 30 minutes passed without a single noise, and I finally started to think the guy had given up. I was seconds away from letting myself calm down when I heard glass shatter from upstairs. It was sharp, fast, and loud enough that it cut right through the storm. He was inside. It didn't make much sense at first, because every window upstairs was reinforced and double-paned. Solid enough that breaking in through any of them would have made a hell of a lot more noise. Then, it hit me. The small roof window that opened into the attic. I hadn't thought about that window in years, mostly because the attic had been shut off for so long. And not just shut, literally sealed. When I ran upstairs to confirm what I already suspected, it was almost a relief to hear his footsteps pounding around up there. It meant he hadn't made it into the actual house. Years earlier, when I first moved into that cabin, I got it for way cheaper than it should have sold for. People in town whispered all kinds of stories about it. They said you could hear footsteps upstairs at night. Said anyone who lived there long enough ended up dead because of some vengeful spirit trapped in the house. I didn't believe any of that crap. I thought I was just getting a great deal. But the truth is, during those first weeks, I learned the hard way that something was actually wrong. I heard footsteps at night. Not the usual creaking wood, but steady, deliberate steps. One night I woke up in full panic, convinced someone was standing in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shape in the corner. A dark, hunched shadow that disappeared the second I turned the light on. I knew I wasn't imagining it. So I called a local woman people swore by. Someone who supposedly dealt with whatever you want to call this stuff. The moment she stepped inside the attic, she told me flat out she couldn't get rid of the spirit. Said it wasn't wandering the house like a ghost. It was attached to the attic, bound to it, angry, and the only real option was trapping it inside so it couldn't spread anywhere else. She told me to line the doorway with salt and silver and keep the attic permanently shut. I did everything she said, but I'm a suspicious person by nature. I didn't trust that a bit of salt and metal would keep something like that contained. So, I hired a guy to seal the entire attic door with actual cement. After that, I still heard footsteps from time to time, but I never had another real problem. Until that night. The man outside must have come through the only entrance that wasn't sealed. That tiny roof window. I heard him pacing like a trapped animal, frantic footsteps racing back and forth. Then suddenly, a short, muffled sound cut through the floorboards. It wasn't a scream exactly, but it was sharp, startled, almost panicked. It was the kind of sound someone makes when they see something they weren't expecting. I didn't know what he'd stumbled into up there. Old beams, loose boards, the pitch black dark. But whatever it was, It scared him badly enough that I heard him scrambling toward the roof window again. Within seconds, I heard him climbing out the same way he came in. A couple of thuds, and then nothing but the storm. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to it move around above me. Whatever the hell lives in that attic. It paced back and forth for hours, heavy steps dragging across the beams like it was unsettled by what had happened. A couple of times I caught myself wondering if it might have slipped out through the window after the guy escaped. But the noises never stopped. It was still up there, still trapped. Maybe the silver lining on the window frame actually did its job. I don't know. I'm not an expert in any of this. I just know that whatever was in my attic stayed where it was supposed to. I still don't know what's in this house with me. Not really. But I do know one thing. That night, for the first time since I moved in, I was actually grateful I wasn't alone in here. Everything I'm about to tell happened roughly a year ago, right at the beginning of the winter months. I remember that the night it all happened, it was snowing, and driving on those roads had always made me uneasy. I live in a remote area of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but I work at a gas station that sits right off one of the busiest highways. I'm not going to say exactly where, because I still work there. Like I said, that night it was snowing, and I still had a 42-minute drive home. I was working the first night shift, so I didn't get out of the station until around 2:30 a.m. It had been a relatively calm night, until a man walked in and was extremely unpleasant to me. At first, he tried to make small talk, like they all do, then moved on to saying I had good muscles and making comments about my body. I told him several times that I wasn't interested, that I had a girlfriend at home, and that he clearly wasn't my type, but he wouldn't stop. The more I pushed back, the more he insisted. At a certain point, he grabbed my wrist and tried to pull me toward him. I barely had time to reach for the gun I keep under the counter. He smiled in the most disgusting way, but he finally walked out. After about 5 minutes, I was relaxed again. After all, I was bigger than he was, and I was armed. I didn't think about it again until my co-worker for the next shift showed up and asked if everything had gone well. I was going to tell him at first, but then I figured it wasn't even worth it, and just smiled and told him to watch out for creeps. When I walked outside, there were 3 vehicles. My car, my co-worker's car, and a work van a bit farther away that looked like it didn't have anyone inside. It had been a solid 45 minutes since anyone had walked into the gas station, so it struck me as a little strange. Still, I didn't give it more than a couple seconds of thought. I got in my car, because the cold was the kind that takes your breath away, and headed home. Even though I had chains on the tires, the late hour and the low visibility turned what should have been a 42-minute drive into more than an hour. When I got home, all I wanted was a quick shower before collapsing into bed. Up until that moment, I hadn't noticed anything wrong. It had been a night like any other. But while I was in the shower, I heard a noise that startled me. It came from inside the house. It sounded like something breaking, but I wasn't absolutely sure. I stayed completely still for several seconds, my heartbeat speeding up while I tried to listen carefully. After a couple of minutes, I calmed myself down, assuming it had been my cat Mia knocking something over. Only when I stepped out of the shower did I realize the bathroom door was closed, and she was in there with me. It couldn't have been her. I finished drying off and getting dressed, and when I left the bathroom, I went through the rooms one by one to see what could have made the noise. The air felt tense, And even Mia was tense, as if she were ready to see something she absolutely didn't want to see just around the corner. Her fur was puffed up, and she reacted to every tiny sound. The house felt darker than it had ever felt before, even with the lights on as I entered each room. There was this overwhelming sense of isolation, a feeling that wasn't inaccurate at all, considering I was miles from the nearest house. Downstairs, right at the bottom of the stairs, I saw a broken vase. That must have been the noise I heard while I was in the shower. I didn't believe it had fallen on its own, but I desperately wanted to believe it had, that it had simply been too close to the edge and slipped. I kept moving slowly through the house, the hair on my arms standing straight up. Then I saw, on top of the couch, a set of clothes. I don't know how long it took me to process the fact that someone was naked in my house. I only know it shocked me completely because of how bizarre the situation felt. I didn't need the clothes to know exactly who it was. But how could he have followed me if I hadn't seen a single car behind me the entire drive? I peeked out the window. There was no car on the street, and I was completely isolated. More than scared, I was furious. I grabbed Mia, mostly afraid that creep would hurt her, then ran to the bedroom to get the gun I kept there. I didn't know where he was. The last thing I wanted was a fight, especially with him being naked. I also didn't know whether he was armed. The moment I stepped into the bedroom, heading straight for the gun, I knew where he was. He was in the room with me, shoved into the closet. The closet door was slightly open, barely pushed in. And when I walked in, I saw something shift inside, just slightly, as if he were adjusting to the surprise of me entering suddenly. Everything clicked at once. I was going to screw that creep over. At that point, I knew he didn't want to confront me. Otherwise, he would have done it already. He wanted to catch me while I was vulnerable, asleep. Without logically walking through a plan, but knowing I had one, I grabbed my phone and pretended to call a friend. Supposedly someone about to drop something off for me, and who would take about 10 minutes to get to my house. That would give me just enough time to lock the guy inside the room and call the police without him suspecting anything until it was too late. I grabbed the comforter from the bed, the gun, and the AC remote, then walked out of the room and locked the door behind me. Mia was much more relaxed now, as if she could feel my calm. The moment I locked the door, I set her down and turned the air conditioning on full blast, freezing cold. It was like everything had lined up perfectly. That wasn't the room I normally used. It was the storage room with no windows, where I didn't keep my clothes. I suffer from migraines, and sometimes they get so bad I can't handle any light at all. That windowless, stimulus-free room is ideal, and I'd been sleeping in it for about 3 days because I'd recently had a really bad migraine. I hadn't switched back to my main bedroom yet, simply because I was lazy and hadn't changed the sheets. On top of that, the closet in that room held my parents' belongings, things that meant something to me, and that I didn't want to get rid of after they died. The only bedding in that room was the one I'd brought out of it, meaning he was naked, in a windowless room, in the dead of winter, with the AC blasting ice-cold air. The room was tiny, so in less than 5 minutes it would feel like a freezer. That night is both the scariest of my life, because of how bizarre it all was, and also one of the nights I'm most proud of myself, knowing that in a moment like that, I not only kept a cool head but managed to outsmart him completely. I waited a full 5 minutes before calling the police. I wanted him practically frozen when they arrived. But after 5 minutes, he was already screaming, begging me to open the door, running around the room trying to stay warm. I don't think I can fully express how entertained I was. When the police arrived, 33 minutes after I called, things got even better when I told them what I had done. The older officer even said that in all his years on the job, he had never come across a story like that. The man was taken away, first to the hospital to stabilize his temperature, then to the police station. The trial is still ongoing, but I know he won't be getting out anytime soon. And the best part is that every time he sees me in the courtroom, I can see a slight trembly in him, like he's afraid of me. I believe that even if he walked free tomorrow, he wouldn't have the guts to get near me, or to harass anyone else ever again.